you don't have a site. Where do you start?
Yeah, great question. So, starting with people, which I know is not always this first thing in the process, but in this case, it's really important because in times of either preparing for disaster or recovering from disaster, it's really important to understand the current needs that people have and the challenges that they're experiencing. Given, say, for instance, if it's a climate disaster that we're trying to recover from, we want to understand the challenges that that individual group of people went through in order to understand how to help prevent that same scenario from happening next time. And we have to really understand and empathize and listen to people on the ground to really respond appropriately.
모스트 보던 팟캐스트.
So maybe now is a great time to introduce our guest, Caroline. Thank you for joining us on another episode of the Most Modern Podcast. You have an incredibly impressive resume. Rice graduate, worked at firms like KPF, Perkins & Will, HKS, and now at Smith Group. Also, other impressive items are you were a technical advisor for Habitat for Humanity and the Global Shelter Cluster. You led adaptation initiatives for the Urban Climate Change Research Network, and you currently serve as the co-chair of Resiliency and Disaster Response committee at the AIDC, and you're also the co-chair of the Sustainable Development Committee of the United Nations Association, as well as a social impact fellow at the World Changing Institute. You've done a lot in a very short amount of time. So I'm wondering, what first attracted you to architecture, a career that many people would say is somewhat unsustainable? And not only that, you're so driven to not only pursue architecture, but also commit yourself to all of these other initiatives. Like, what first attracted you to the profession and what continues to drive you to move forward?
For sure. So I see architecture as a very multidisciplinary approach as a career because architects are coordinating with engineers, we're coordinating with a lot of landscape architects and people that work in the natural environment, but then also coordinating with government entities, with public sector, with private sector, with all kinds of a range of clients and needs. So I see the profession as being one that is never boring. It's always changing every day. And it's also very relevant to all of us because we spend so much of our time in architecture and experiencing architecture. And it's very central to our time here on Earth. So I see it as a way to serve people in space, but also a way to coordinate and work with lots of disciplines to improve our environment.
Yeah. You, as you said, there's many ways to practice architecture, and the very well be the designers and the big names, which most of us kind of get taught at school. But you took a different path. You're focusing more on the resiliency part of the architecture side. Could you tell us more about why that was attractive to you, and how you started to be more engaged in those type of areas?
Absolutely. So kind of getting to what I was mentioning about people and really wanting to serve needs that people have or wants, I see resilience as very central to serving people in situations where perhaps there is suffering or there is some degree of challenge or even injustice. And so I'm drawn to resilient design because I care about things like climate justice, where, for instance, when a storm comes and it affects some way more than others, it bothers me. So resilience really motivates me to stay in because I can see the ways that it can help people who are feeling injustices related to climate change.
I think that's a really interesting perspective, like the role of an architect as service, and one that might not be commonly shared across architects everywhere. And I find it so interesting that architects are usually kind of this very top-down role, like I know what's best for people, but yet it feels like you come the other way, like what do people need? And then, right, design is in service of that. Like, was this a feeling that you had before going to school, something you acquired in school, or was this something that you felt kind of with some of the initiatives that you engaged in after graduation?
Yeah, absolutely. So service has always been a part of me, and it's been a part of my upbringing. It's always what wakes me up in the morning. So when I was in high school, like I would wake up at 4 a.m. to plan service events for for this organization called Key Club in high school. And it was just like such a joy to me. And it really made me feel so alive when I could spend some of my time not only studying and not only, engaging with family and friends, but also like serving my community. It's just been a thread that kind of honestly keeps me going to think about architecture and career in the lens of serving others, or else I don't know why I would do it.
Well, I was also in Key Club in high school, and I definitely did not wake up at 4 a.m. So definitely, kudos to you for your dedication. So I guess let's talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that you chose to engage in after graduation. Global Shelter Cluster or Habitat for Humanity. Like, how did your energy and your knowledge as an architect benefit some of these initiatives you engaged in?
Yeah, absolutely. So I recently finished a master's at UIC Barcelona in international cooperation for sustainable emergency architecture. And that program, it gave me a lot of exposure to the humanitarian world of architecture. And it really complemented my experience at the Rice School of Architecture, which gave a great theoretical and basis background for what an architect does, what a designer does, what the design process is. So this master's program, it launched me and gave me opportunities to work with international NGOs, like you mentioned, the Global Shelter Cluster. So I collaborated with a professor who works with Care International to work with his team on the ground in northwest Syria.
Wow.
And I was working remotely. I was working here from the US, supporting this team. Together, we came up with about 15 different schemes for homes for individuals who were displaced by earthquakes in Syria to migrate to. But we didn't want these shelters to feel temporary and to feel unhomelike. And so we really invested speaking with people there on the ground about some of their preferences culturally, but also just personal preferences. And those ideas played into the schemes. These projects that we designed and then are now being developed, they really do look like homes instead of, tents or containers. They really have the look and feel of being home, which is great because we don't know exactly how long people will be displaced to those shelters. And usually, unfortunately, refugees and IDPs, internally displaced people, are often in a situation where they have to stay in that area for, 10, 15 years, unfortunately, due to conflicts or climate disasters. So that master's program really gave me more skill sets and more insights into how to do that type of work with really very conscious lens of culture and meaning of home to different people.
This is so fascinating because, as a developer who builds homes in cities, we often deal with, frankly, on the upfront of things, we often deal with mostly the risks involved with the project, financial risks and constraints, building code constraints. But I assume those won't be applied to the shelter type of designs. But I'm sure there are a set of constraints that you deal with. Could you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had local architects working with us who are familiar with the local codes. So architects from Syria and Turkey, and they handled a lot of that process as we were developing the schemes and then creating the construction documents and the renderings. They were very much looking to always meet code.
And what was different did you find something different from the typical houses and living situations in the US versus, you mentioned that you wanted to create a sense of home and a space far more than just a tent or a shelter. What was the key difference there? Like, what did you adapt, or what did you discover through this project?
Because I was a little distant, I didn't have too many conversations with people on the ground, but I heard about a lot of them from my team. And there were also several needs assessments done to understand what are some of the needs and preferences of the individuals. But I think architecturally speaking, some of the things that I noticed as I was working on the drawings were, for instance, the idea of community being a really important part of the culture. And what that looked like, or what that translated to, was, for instance, some of the schemes had a nice porch where people could gather and meet with their neighbors and have, a dedicated outdoor space for that. In some cases, though, individuals, they preferred a little more privacy. And so we had other schemes where that kind of gathering space was indoors and could be a little bit more intimate. So I would say, this goes for most of us, but the fact that everybody kind of prefers different, and we're not all the same, right? And so trying to create different ideas and designs that are going to tap into some of those different needs and preferences, rather than saying everybody gets the same one. And it is like a more careful process, and in some ways, like, you have to put more thought into it. But the outcome of it is that I think individuals feel more ownership of, my ideas were heard, and this scheme is one that I chose. This home is one that I chose the design for, and I feel good here. This is what I want, versus I'm getting what everybody else is and I don't like it.
So how does this work internationally impact kind of your work at home? Can you tell us a little bit about your role as the sustainability specialist at Smith Group?
So I am the East Coast sustainability specialist, and therefore all of the projects that I'm on right now are on the East Coast. Some are in DC, some are up in Boston, a few in Florida, scattered a bit. But I would say that the experience, for instance, with the Global Shelter Cluster is quite different from my experience with Smith Group. And I've found that I do like the kind of duality of not only supporting projects like, for higher ed clients here in the US, but also serving where the needs are greatest in some capacity as well. So I understand and realize, like, as a US citizen, that I am in a privileged situation being from here and living here, and that I have access to a lot of resources that others might not. And so therefore I sort of feel this longing, or this desire to serve in situations where there aren't as many resources, while also contributing to my home community in the US.
So I think, as we know, like, despite being the richest country in the world, the US is far from an equal society.
For sure.
Does your desire to kind of serve this balance drive maybe some of your more domestic commitments, such as like Climate Ready DC or the AIA Disaster Response Committee? Like, what are the role of these committees or organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking about Climate Ready DC, so the process that we've been doing there is that we've been meeting with community members, with people at different local events who are willing to talk to us about their experience of climate change in the DC area. And from what we hear, not only from these community events, but also through focus groups with particular individuals that maybe experience climate differently. For instance, like focus groups with kids, focus groups with the elderly, focus groups with renters versus homeowners, and understanding how are different people experiencing climate change differently in our own backyard is really important to me to respond to those particular needs and challenges. And similarly with, for instance, the AIADC Disaster Resilience and Disaster Response Committee. So this committee is really focused on basically trying to prepare local architects for when a disaster strikes, like preparing us for how to help. So we go through various trainings on, for instance, how to evaluate homes that have been affected by, we don't get many of them around here, but earthquakes or floods or other climate challenges. And it's training us to prepare for when a disaster could strike in the future and how to help respond. And then the committee, the UNANCA Sustainable Development Committee, is focused right now on something called the Global Goals at Home program. So you're probably familiar with the UN SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which range from all different topics around hunger, around access to clean energy, etc. And trying to not only think about the UN SDGs as something applicable to international contexts, but also to our neighbors here who maybe are hungry and who don't have the same access to renewable energy, who maybe don't have access to clean water, etc. So these kinds of initiatives that I see having a big priority often internationally, I think it's also great that we have local organizations applying them here in the US for that same situation, like you were saying, where there is a lot of inequality in the US, and lots of people that don't have the same access to resources.
I guess, can you paint us a picture of why climate change impacts different communities in these really unfair and different ways, maybe to kind of help our listeners and, Minku and I to kind of better understand and better learn from you, like, what are these things that we should know about the impact of our work?
Yeah, for sure. Let's see. For instance, like one of the greatest climate challenges in DC right now is extreme heat. So the district keeps getting warmer and warmer, and it has particular effects on children and the elderly, especially children under 5 and then elderly above 75. The reason for that is because, babies and toddlers, they have only developed so much to be able to respond to and adapt to their environment to such an extent. And so they sometimes will suffer from heat. Or I remember like when I was in Malawi, for instance, and I was working on a set of projects that were serving babies in neonatal wards, that babies really require certain temperatures in order to be able to regulate their body temperature. So, for instance, when a baby's born, really needs a nice warm space to be in, or that skin to skin time to stay warm in order to regulate the body temperature. So all that to say is that heat really affects small children, but it also affects elderly. Essentially, the elderly suffer from urban heat a lot because their bodies are in some ways also less able to adapt and change as they get older. So I know that each of us will go through this process of our bodies changing over time, but yeah, really as we're young and as we're older, that is when it's most difficult.
You were mentioning that the streets are getting more hotter and it's getting more dangerous for the toddlers and also the elderly. What is a good strategy to deal with it?
It's a great question, and that's what we've been asking people in the community about, like some of their ideas to kind of gain more of that community voice in the Resilient DC plan. And so some of the ideas that community members have brought are, can we have some more areas of concentrated forest within the city where we could go and kind of cool off, but also have this immersion in nature for a little bit before going back into the city, just to kind of break up some of the city concrete kind of experience. But then some other ideas are, for instance, bus stops even having like a nice
Canopies.
cover, canopy and fans, so that people who are, like so many of us who take public transit, aren't having to sit there in the heat for so long, but can actually feel cool as they're waiting for the bus to come. Or, more trees in general lining streets. Not only is that an idea to help with urban heat, but also wellness, which is another important consideration for overall resilience of people, of our feeling of being okay, of being well, is to really think about, okay, I feel good on this street. It has trees. I feel cool. I feel like I am having an experience that feels more natural than this other street where there aren't any trees, and I feel happier here. So it's kind of this, what we're going for, and what we're hearing a lot from the community is kind of this holistic wellness plus climate resilience adaptation ideas.
I wish we can bring the streets of Barcelona and copy paste to Washington. That will solve our problem.
Yeah, that would be nice. Barcelona is amazing. They're really trying to green up Barcelona, because it is a city that lacks some green spaces, like so many European cities. For instance, I lived in Naples, Italy, and there were any parks. And the reason for that, well, there was one park. The reason for that is because, these older cities that were constructed even like 2,000 or 1,000 years ago, they didn't always understand yet, like, the integration of green with city. So city planning has changed over time, and people's preferences have changed over time. And that's why it's so important to check in with our local community to see what their needs and preferences are, so that the city can adapt to what they want in that time.
So one thing we talk a lot about, I think, on this podcast is how hard it is to get something built. I think especially in this case, when you've vetted ideas with the community, right? You've gathered all these great ideas, you know that they're going to work and be well liked by the community that they're implemented in. How do you then work with the city, with kind of the stakeholders that are responsible for building some of these solutions? How do you get them to buy in and then implement these ideas?
Yeah, so for instance, with this Climate Ready DC project, the individuals or the entity working with us is the DOEE, the Department of Energy, as well as the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency. And so these entities are wanting to help with, things like climate justice in our local community. And so I find that a lot of people already believe in this desire around improving our conditions and our equity towards climate change, like amidst climate change. And it's just a matter, really, I think, of working together to ensure that we can get them built. And it takes many people coming together to really make these changes. So it takes those partnerships with government, it takes partnership with community engagement consultants, and it takes partnership with built environment professionals to really make those changes. Not only that, but something that I am quite passionate about too is like working with lawyers around policy to couple with some of these built environment changes. So for instance, the committee that is the UNA NCA Sustainable Development Committee, my co-chair on that is a lawyer, and we work hand in hand to coordinate policy recommendations with planning recommendations to address climate justice and the Global Goals at Home program.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, because I think one of the things we consistently talk about is like the tension between building and policy and the limitations of kind of having to deal with these constraints. But I hear from your perspective that these two things actually go hand in hand. So can you speak, I guess, from the perspective of an architect, a designer, like why is it so important to work with policymakers, and how can policy help us build better?
So I think that policy is really powerful for progressing change and also addressing certain needs and certain wants of a community. And I think that the built environment couples really well with policy, because it's putting, in a lot of ways, policy to action if the policy is rooted in some kind of development change. And so these, I see these two coming together in a really powerful way, as they're working together. I think it's super important to not stay siloed, but to talk amongst each other and to plan amongst each other and really be advocates for, our cities and for the people in our local communities, especially those who are feeling injustices. And in particular, my area of that is climate justice. And so listening to stories and then having those stories inform both policy and built environment updates.
So I guess, can you give us a expert's explanation of what is climate justice and what is something that we should know about it from, I guess, non-experts and curious listeners?
I will say I don't consider myself an expert, but I do consider myself, actually, I heard someone say this recently, like a creative amateur, where the word amateur actually is rooted, the root of the Latin word is to do for the love of. So be creative and to do for the love of. That's kind of what drives me. And so I think that this definition of climate justice, in my evolving awareness of it, is essentially coming alongside people, empathizing with people, listening to people who are feeling injustices related to climate changes that are happening around us and acting on those expressed feelings of injustice. So to me, climate justice is rooted in, again, like people and listening to people and then responding. And another way that I think about this is in terms of the word resilience, where we think, the definition of the word resilience is the ability to successfully adapt to stressors. And so listening to individuals who are having to adapt to stressors way more frequently than maybe some others that, aren't in the same position is something that I kind of consider a part of climate justice, is, trying to limit stressors for those that are feeling the most stress, the most hardship, the most suffering related to climate change.
Is there any repeated opinions that you remember or is there anything that specific situations that you remember that came up when you were doing the research related to the climate, any situations of climate injustice? I'm just curious about a specific case.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, I'm going to be analyzing a lot of those responses soon. So I haven't taken a deep dive into too many of them yet. But I do remember recently being in the room with some kids who were expressing that they are really concerned for their future, but also they're concerned about how climate change is impacting their health. Because they were mentioning, for instance, there was a couple of kids who were mentioning that they had asthma and how some of the changing climate was leading to them needing to go to the hospital more frequently and having to miss school. So I think that was like one example of, a case where this child didn't regularly have to go to the hospital for this before, but now they do, and they are understanding that part of the contributing factor is the changing climate.
So I think the urban setting around kind of DC is really interesting because it's, as we know, urban places are where a lot of the injustices that we experience are physicalized and manifest in our environment. I guess for you, do you think that climate change is something that's or exacerbating existing injustices, or are there kind of new injustices introduced because and as a result of climate change?
It's a great question. I am still learning, but I think that climate change is definitely exacerbating some of the injustices, for instance, around poverty, around hunger, around health and well-being. And so I think that those are becoming more and more difficult. For instance, when urban heat in DC is impacting the crops that can grow there and the seasons that the crops grow, like in this DC, Maryland, Virginia area, it then begins to impact the local access to food. And yes, we can get our food from elsewhere. That increases the overall demand from getting it elsewhere when we could be producing it locally. So I think that in general, as population grows, as cities grow, that we need more and more localized resources for things like food and clean water and good places to go for health and well-being in our cities more and more. So all that to say is I in general think that climate change is exacerbating some of the challenges and is likely causing other challenges that I am learning more and more about over time.
Okay. So I think one of the things with kind of sustainability and resiliency that we often hear about is that sometimes what you need to do to help a community have a better environment, enjoy more wellness is not perhaps the most sustainable thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yet it's the thing that will help them the most. So as someone who, listens to the community, helps come up with these ideas, these policies that will eventually change our built environment, how do you balance the need for sustainability and the needs of the people?
Mm-hmm. So this is really making me think about my experience in Cape Town, South Africa, because I have some friends there that I spent a summer with who are living in the townships in Cape Town, which are basically that typology, that urban typology is the legacy of apartheid. What happened is during apartheid, people were forcibly displaced to the outskirts of the city where the land is less fertile and less desirable and also often floods more frequently. And so when I think about my friends there and some of the needs and wants that they've expressed to me of things that they need immediately, it's things like food, things like roof repair, because when it's raining, they feel like they're outside because the rain is coming into their home, their shack. And so some of those things that they're voicing they want the most are sometimes good in terms of sustainability, and sometimes they're only like band-aids on the root of the injustice or the problem. And so, I remember when a friend of mine in one of the Cape Town townships had asked me, Caroline, can you come back and actually build me a home? Like, I want a stable home. I don't want to live in this shelter anymore because it feels like unsustainable to her and she dreams of a home. And that is something where I feel like that could be a more sustainable or long-term option for a lot of people who are in kind of a more informal housing situation. But it requires, like we were just speaking about, it requires a lot of integration with government and policy to really make those more sustainable approaches possible, versus kind of putting the Band-Aid on some of these challenges that relate to climate change, like flooding or droughts or infertile lands that are preventing farming.
I think you make it sound really easy that they just get all these people together and talk to them, and then we'll agree on something that, is able to balance all of these needs. But I imagine that actually doing the work is much harder. Can you talk a little bit about what challenges you faced?
I think, that I feel like in some ways that I haven't done enough, actually, because it takes a long time to get things done. And it also takes a great investment in one place. And I recognize that. I think that so far my experience has been colored by a plethora of different contexts, which has been really valuable. But I think in order to really make longer term impact over time, it requires that deep connection to the community. So, I mean, right now I'm living in the DC area and I'm from this area, and it's a bit of like a coming home thing where, I know this area well and I'm kind of investing deeply in it. And I've simultaneously have learned from these international experiences and some of the challenges or conditions that are happening there in order to be able to share across resources from my home here to places that might also benefit from resources or ideas that I've had the privilege to spend time learning more about. And so I think too, like this example from Cape Town, I remember while I was there, I had the privilege as a US citizen to set up a meeting with the mayor of Cape Town to voice some of these needs, preferences, challenges that I was hearing from the community in the Lavender Hill Township, and bringing those ideas to the mayor's office. And I gave him a presentation about, for instance, like these solar powered mobile clinics that the community expressed wanting because they were at that time lacking access to basic health care. The health facilities there were so overrun and so far and few between right around them and they don't have access to vehicles themselves. So it was difficult to go farther than their local healthcare facility. So anyway, this express need, I designed some ideas for that with the community and then put it in a presentation, and I presented it to the mayor, and the mayor said, okay, that's a great idea. And he's like, can you get the funding for that? And I said, I can try. And so I came back to the US because I had to go back and do another semester at school, and tried really hard to fundraise to go and be able to implement this. But it was very difficult to actually raise the funds to do that at that time. And I realized, that there's a lot that I need to learn in order to actually be able to implement some of these programs for communities or in contexts that ask for them. So all that to say is like, I feel like we could all do more to kind of serve needs long term. And I definitely believe in investing in local community and in, the places where we have those relationships and those connections to really see them through.
And learning how to fundraise.
Yep, and learning how to fundraise.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something like in this humanitarian and development space is one of the biggest challenges, honestly. I find it a little bit difficult sometimes when funds are given towards certain projects, but not others that could potentially help more people. And so something that I definitely like to advocate for is that funds are more evenly dispersed between different people and voices in the community, and not mainly going towards one group of people. I think it's definitely something that I've been learning about as I go, though, because I understand that, growth and economy and market and all of that is like very important to consider. So it's a learning game as we learn as architects, as designers who are interested in humanitarian work. Like, it's a learning game to understand how to find the funding, how to advocate for those projects, how to get the right people in the room, and how to really then implement the project and pass it, like really ideally, passing the funding to the local community to have them implement it and own it with, whatever like service I can to help in that process, but really like passing it to them is the goal.
Yeah, the more I have these type of discussions, the more I believe that architecture is really an art of communication, because you need to involve so many different entities, and money also being a type of a tool or medium to communicate the values. And I think architects, we have a good heart, and we try to do the best of work. And I think at the end of the day, money is really what makes it real and what also brings every parties together. So perhaps to your point, like learning how the money works, the more our career progresses, appears as a very important tool to learn. So perhaps at the start of the academic career, if we can find ways to also not neglect, but talk more about how to do these things, how to fundraise, and what's important, maybe that could be blended into the academic tool, so that architects can also make more real impacts.
That is a great idea, to integrate that piece into academics, I think, and to, just really like encourage us, even in our years as students, to seek out opportunities to serve our local community with architecture as a vessel to do that. So yeah, I think like one of the things that Rice offers is this design build course. And I think that is really an intention and an ambition behind it, is to have students design and then build something for their local community that will serve certain needs. And I think the more and more we can implement that process at school and include fundraising as part of that, the better for teaching the next generation about that process and how to really get projects done, have a social impact.
Yeah, you should pull some knowledge from Minku, because it does sound like development with a lot more steps and a lot more
Oh
involvement.
my. The development is art of not losing money.
Yeah.
Well, I guess one question I do want to ask is, like, we talk, I think, a lot from a very US and Eurocentric perspective about a lot of these issues, but someone like you who have contact, who have experience with a lot of like international, kind of more broad experience, like what's one thing that we can learn kind of as Americans, as people who are very US centric, about the rest of the world, in order to, not only gain a more worldly perspective, but also just understand better what change is coming?
I think a lot of what I have learned has been through talking and meeting with people. And so one of the things that I'm thinking about is when I was in Malawi and having this experience where I could meet with, for instance, people working in the hospital to really understand how they would like to use this USAID grant to renovate their neonatal wards, rather than me coming in and saying, hey, I think you should do this. Like, what I've learned in my experience is that the open hand approach of like, here, please let me know your ideas, and this place much better than me, this culture, your patients so much better than me. Can you please give me your ideas of how you would renovate the neonatal ward, and then I will work with you to try to draw that up. And it's actually something I learned in my master's program, was this phrase of passing the pen. So literally, like, I think us as architects, we like to have control, and we like to have the pen in hand to draw what we envision. But in reality, like when we're in a new, especially, I would say, we could practice this anytime, but especially when we're in a different context that we didn't grow up in or that we're not very familiar with, like it's very important to kind of approach that with humility and passing the pen and allowing them to shape that renovation rather than me leading those ideas. So I think, just from my experience in different international contexts, like each one is different, but in general, I think that one of the approaches to take would be to just like let them tell you how things are there and what they want and what they need, rather than us coming and trying to impose something or tell them what they need. Yeah. So I definitely have valued the international experiences because it's also even helped and influenced my approach locally. Listening to community voices first is ideal before acting. Or even like when I was working on several healthcare projects, we would always have these user group meetings before putting pen to paper most of the time, because those doctors, those nurses often know much better than we know about exactly what they need.
So pass the pen, right? Learn from the experts about what they need. So I think as we wrap up, I do have one final question. If you had a magic wand and you can wave away anything in the world, what would that be? And how would that change our world for the better?
I have to think about this for a second. This is stemming back to something that I've held on to for many years as like my dream. And my dream would be that everyone has access to a home, because I feel that the home is like the basis for everything else. And For instance, I had worked with this organization and had volunteered with them, and this organization was supporting women who were recovering from, just really difficult situations. I won't mention details, but they were recovering and needed a safe place to call home for a while to basically find their footing again and to be able to, for instance, apply to jobs and have a safe place to do that and to just feel secure for a while. And so I think this idea of having a safe place to call your own, a safe home, is a really crucial thing that I wish and hope for everyone, because like I mentioned, I think that lots of things stem from that. So the passions were one of my callings when I go outside for a run, for instance, is to, especially when I was in Houston, was to interact with some of the people who didn't have homes and to befriend them and to not ignore them and to try to understand why they were in that situation, why they didn't have a home to call their own. And often feedback that I would hear when speaking with them is that they would really love to have a home, but this, and this happened and they don't have their documents anymore. And, it's impossible for them to rent because, these legal documents are missing, etc. And so anyway, I wish that sometimes all of those challenges would just be lifted and that people could have a home who don't have access to a home. I think it's really a human need and a human right that I actively want to work towards.
Yes.
I think that's beautiful. I think we're good to end on that note, and we'll edit in kind of a closing.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern. 모스트 포던 팟캐스트